Don't you know? Talking about a revolution sounds whisper. Poor people gonna rise up, get their share. Poor people gonna rise up and take what's theirs. Don't you know you better run, 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 run.
All right, well, securitization, quickly. The two processes I've just talked about lead to a political confrontation. And then that creates a consciousness within the bourgeois society. So one part of that is this securitization, so fluidity, escape particular working classes. But in the end, that can't be done. You have to have a social view once you've got this kind of perspective, and that requires management of the system. And very briefly, what that means then is welfare, guaranteeing full employment. But these things gradually fall away because working classes won't be controlled by those kind of systems. So then you end up with a kind of split in this period. This concern about the potential of revolution is something that obsesses, first of all, the bourgeois. So the possibility of revolution, which is the starting point of our thing, is something that is already of concern for bourgeois society. And it affects the way they deal with things. So managing welfare, managing the economy. So if you look, I'm going to jump ahead then to the recent crisis. If you look at that, in fact it's from 87, but they've had a low interest rate policy in America. In Greenspan from 2000, very low interest rates. Then what does that lead to? It leads to subprime. So we've got this process of preventing revolution, preventing class war, which they're quite explicit about. What does that do? Because we don't want to have a recession, because the recession leads to the political problems. So we prevent recession, prevent the destruction of capital. So what happens? We get bubbles. So then you get another bubble, then you get a subprime bubble. And each period that this occurs, this is widening. The whole problem is getting bigger and bigger as we go on. So the dot-com was a big crisis for America. The subprime was a big crisis for the world. And then they answer that by the same process, lower interest rates, and then we've got more bubbles. They're now in China. Property prices in China, for goodness sake, are now another bubble. So we have a process then of a system which is signalling its own end. But where you've got bubbles, it means they can no longer form labour. The irony, the deep irony, I think, for America is if you go to Detroit, where they used to make cars, this is also the basis of the subprime. They stopped making cars, but what they do is they sell subprime mortgages. You've got this very strange situation there of selling houses to people who can't afford them because they don't work in the factories that have gone away. This is a system in the last kind of gasp of trying to work out what to do next. I say last gasp, that doesn't mean an immediate end. Last gasp could be 20 years, I'm afraid. One doesn't want to get too triumphalist about this, but the point here is that this is a system that's signalling its own end. I'll finish on that.
Well, this meeting is packed out. And I imagine the reason you're here is because you want to know the answer. Is there going to be a revolution? And,
if we have anything to do with it, yes, there is.
I'm delighted to hear that. The organisers have confronted me with that question, and I feel I've got to give an answer. The trouble is that last time I gave this talk, which was 18 months ago at the Anarchist Book Fair, just after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, I gave a rather similar talk, and half the room stormed out. So if you're going to all walk out, obviously it'll be just squeeze getting through the door. I hope you won't. I was actually in the middle. Somebody had a Romanesque broccoli, which I asked for. By chance, actually, somebody actually had one, and I was just talking about the geometry of historical time and whether it was linear or non-linear. And I was just getting into self-similarity, the Mandelbrot set, sensitive dependence on initial conditions and invariance through transformations of scale, and it was at that point that everybody moved out. So maybe I wasn't quite on the right wavelength, and I've got to try and avoid doing that kind of thing today. I'm not going to. Well, actually, as Joe said, I've been sacked. So thank goodness I don't have to give you an academic lecture. And I'm certainly not going to kind of ponder the statistical probabilities of a revolution in this century. I've always actually had the feeling that if I've got anything to do with it, everything's going to be all right. And sometimes I come to a meeting and I find there's other comrades in the hall with exactly that same position. If I've got anything to do with it, things are going to be okay. And if you think that way and you start connecting up, then if we've got anything to do with it, everything's going to be all right. It's actually very worrying out there. I mean, we are actually, and I'm a scientist, we are either on the tipping point or extremely close to the tipping point of irreversible climate change. You look at Mars, you look at Venus, you look at Earth, this is a rather amazing planet. And the other two planets don't have life on, and James Hansen, the main climate scientist who tells us to get active in the streets, is very, very concerned actually that this planet could go disastrously wrong, such that even in 300 or 400 years' time there's actually not even life on it, that we have a feedback process. So that's bad. And various other things bad as far as the left is concerned. But in terms of the moment we're at, the objective requirement and possibility of revolution, it has never been better. We are only 18 months past the collapse of the banking system. We're still in the middle of that process. If we get our act together and start connecting up, it's not just a question of how probable the revolution is, it is a certainty. I'm not going to have too much time. 20 minutes isn't very long, and I'm just going to say, well, I often get to the end of this and I realise I haven't said the most important thing. So let me just say the three things which are going to come out rather like sort of bullet points, they're just like statements, and of course you might think I'm completely mad at least. First of all, we've won the revolution already. The revolution which matters, we've already won it. We've just heard about some other revolutions. Of course, you know, these are part of an enormous process going on. For me, the revolution which is the most convincing, if you like, is the one that worked. Those other revolutions, those involved in those revolutions had the ideals, had the commitment, but actually the outcome of those revolutions, the English Revolution, French Revolution, Russian Revolution, actually, if you think of Napoleon or Stalin, whatever, they were the opposite of the ideals that the revolutionaries entered those revolutions with. But there was a revolution which worked, and the proof is, here we are. And I'm talking about the human revolution. The human revolution was the event in the course of which we as a species acquired language, the ability to see ourselves as others see us, reason, if you like, everything which makes us such a strange, in many ways extraordinary and wonderful species, happened somewhere in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, about 150,000 years ago. And when I was talking about whether the geometry of historical time is linear or non-linear, the overwhelming probability is that there's some wobble, but it's not a perfectly straight line, and the things which happen because of that wobble aren't just things in the past. The past isn't just in the past. There's a connection. Things which happened in the past are still part of the present. So, and that's just another way of saying, in terms of chaos theory, what of course Marx and Engels always say, which is that there's a dialectic to history. So the revolution I'm committed to is the human revolution, and we need to understand what it was that made it work. Because if it's true that it happened, and it's pretty indisputable, then in a real sense, our task is to do it again. We've got to discover our humanity again. We've got to discover the power of language, the fact that we can communicate with each other, the fact that we can, in a way, do science simply by getting out of ourselves and checking out the way we see things and the way our comrades see things around us. That's the first point. Study the human revolution.
Talking about a revolution.